The small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, exists in that peculiar American geography where suburban order and rural isolation intersect. The houses are modest, the streets tree-lined, and the general assumption among residents is that the worst thing likely to happen on any given day involves a minor fender bender or a neighborhood dispute over property lines. It is exactly the kind of place where people feel safe, where children ride bicycles without supervision, where doors are left unlocked and the future is assumed to be merely an extension of an acceptable present. But Millbrook, like every place, contained darker currents beneath its surface. It contained poverty, disguised by well-maintained appearances. It contained pain hidden behind white picket fences, and it contained, in a modest ranch house on Elderberry Lane, a situation so fractured and so desperate that it would eventually rupture in a way that would shatter the illusions the town had constructed about itself. The house belonged to a woman named Catherine Wee, age 43, and her son, Michael Wee, age 13. Catherine had been married once, briefly, to Michael's father, a man who had departed the picture when Michael was 3 years old. She had raised her son alone, working 2 jobs for most of his life, first as a dental hygienist, later as a pharmacy technician when the dental office closed. She had done her best, or at least she had convinced herself that she had done her best, which amounted to the same thing in her own calculus. Michael was a thin, quiet boy with dark eyes and the kind of posture that suggested he was trying to take up as little space as possible. His teachers described him as intelligent but withdrawn. His grades were adequate but inconsistent. He had few friends, seemed to have no hobbies or interests that engaged him passionately, and spent most of his time outside of school in his room, though what he did there remained a mystery to his mother and the outside world. Catherine loved her son. This is important to establish at the outset, because what would eventually happen would be interpreted by many as evidence that she did not, that she was neglectful, that she was cruel. But love and competence are not the same thing, and Catherine's love for Michael was genuine, even if her ability to understand him, to see him, to recognize his suffering was severely limited. There were signs, looking back, that something was profoundly wrong. Michael had stopped attending extracurricular activities when he was 9 years old. He had withdrawn from friendships that had once seemed important to him. He exhibited what school counselors would later describe as symptoms of depression, a flat affect, social isolation, a pervasive sense of hopelessness about the future. Catherine attributed these things to adolescence, to the normal angst of growing up, to the typical moodiness of a boy entering his teenage years. She did not understand that she was observing manifestations of something far more serious, something that required intervention beyond what a working mother with her own set of psychological struggles could provide. Catherine herself had a history of depression. She had been hospitalized briefly when Michael was 5 years old, though she rarely spoke about this. She had struggled with alcohol for several years in her 20s, though she had managed to maintain sobriety since Michael's birth. She carried a kind of emotional fragility that made it difficult for her to recognize or respond to emotional fragility in others, particularly in her son. The household dynamic was characterized by a kind of exhausted tolerance. Catherine worked long hours. Michael did his schoolwork and stayed out of his mother's way. They did not fight, not in any dramatic sense, but neither did they truly connect. There were no family dinners where they discussed their days. There were no moments of genuine intimacy or mutual understanding. There was only a kind of parallel existence, 2 people occupying the same space without being truly present to each other. And underneath this surface normalcy, something was festering, Psychologists and investigators who would later examine Michael's case would attempt to pinpoint the exact moment when his deterioration accelerated, when he transformed from a withdrawn but functional boy into something far more disturbed. But there was no single moment. Instead, there was a series of accumulations, a slow addition of weight to an already fragile structure. When Michael was 11, his grandmother, Catherine's mother, died suddenly from a massive stroke. The funeral was held on a cold day in November, and Michael attended in a suit that was slightly too large for him, standing beside his mother as people offered condolences that no one quite knew how to deliver because there was nothing appropriate to say. Catherine grieved intensely for several months. She had been close to her mother, and her death created a void in her life that she did not know how to fill. Michael, in contrast, seemed largely unaffected by his grandmother's death. He did not cry at the funeral. He did not speak about missing her. He seemed, to observers, to have moved past the event with a kind of disconnected ease. But Michael was not unaffected. He was experiencing something more insidious, a sense that the people who were supposed to protect him and provide stability were themselves unstable, that death was random and sudden and could remove people at any moment, and that there was no real security in the world at all. 6 months after his grandmother's death, Michael's best friend, a boy named David who lived 2 houses down, moved away. His father had gotten a job transfer, and the family relocated to Arizona. Michael had spent considerable time with David, more time than he spent with his mother, and David's departure created another void. Then, in the summer between 6th and 7th grade, Michael experienced something that would haunt him for years. He was at a community pool when another boy, older, more physically developed, began to harass him about his body. The harassment was relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, jokes about his thinness, mimicked movements, but to Michael, who was already struggling with feelings of powerlessness and inadequacy, it felt catastrophic. He left the pool and did not return for the rest of the summer. These events, individually, might not have been significant, but cumulatively, they created a psychological landscape in Michael's mind that was increasingly barren and hostile. He began to believe that he was fundamentally alone in the world, that no one truly cared about him, that the universe was indifferent to his existence and actively hostile to his well-being. He started spending more time online, in spaces where he could be anonymous, where he could exist without the vulnerability that came with physical presence. He discovered forums and chat rooms populated by people who shared his sense of alienation, people who spoke in dark terms about hopelessness and the meaninglessness of existence. Catherine noticed that he was spending a lot of time on his computer, but she did not investigate further. She was working 60-hour weeks, exhausted, dealing with her own depression, and her own sense that she was failing at the basic requirements of life. She did not have the emotional bandwidth to parent a struggling teenager, and so she did not. And Michael, alone in his room, began to construct a narrative of himself as someone fundamentally broken, fundamentally unlovable, someone whose existence was a burden to others and would never improve. What happened between Catherine and Michael during the months preceding the incident cannot be precisely reconstructed because neither of them spoke about it in detail. And after the incident, neither was particularly interested in providing context that might humanize the other. But from interviews with neighbors, teachers, and Michael's later statements to investigators, a picture emerges of escalating tension between a mother who was at the end of her psychological resources and a son who was drowning in a darkness he did not have the language or support to articulate. Michael's grades began to slip. He received a failing mark in English, which required Catherine to attend a parent-teacher conference where she was informed that her son was not completing assignments and seemed disengaged from the curriculum. Catherine responded by implementing rules, restrictions on computer usage, requirements that he do his homework at the kitchen table where she could monitor him, consequences for continued academic failure. These restrictions, implemented from a place of parental concern, felt to Michael like a prison tightening around him. The one space where he had found any semblance of solace, the online world where he could escape, was being taken away. He began to sneak computer usage late at night, staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning to communicate with people online who understood his despair and seemed to validate it. Catherine discovered the late-night usage one night when she went to check on him and found him at the computer at 2:45 a.m. She was furious in a way that surprised them both. She shut down the computer, grounded him, took away his internet access for 2 weeks. Michael experienced this as a betrayal. His mother, who he already felt did not understand him or care about his well-being, had taken away the only thing keeping him alive. That is how he would later describe it, with the black and white thinking of an adolescent in crisis. She had taken away the only thing keeping him alive. Over the following weeks, Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would have moments of apparent normalcy, going to school and completing assignments, and then would lapse into periods of profound withdrawal where he would not leave his room except to go to school and use the bathroom. Catherine, exhausted and frightened by changes she did not understand, responded with a combination of strictness and neglect. She would impose consequences, and then, when they did not seem to be working, would simply give up and leave Michael alone. She did not take him to see a counselor or a psychiatrist, despite the obvious signs of mental illness. She did not reach out to family or friends for support or advice. She simply endured, waiting for this phase to pass, assuming that Michael would eventually grow out of whatever was troubling him. She did not understand that her son was suicidal, that he spent hours contemplating methods of ending his life, that he had moved beyond the abstract consideration of suicide into concrete planning. She did not understand because Michael did not tell her, and she did not ask. The evening of May 17th began unremarkably. Catherine had worked a closing shift at the pharmacy and did not arrive home until nearly 10 p.m. She was tired, her feet ached, and she wanted nothing more than to pour herself a glass of wine, watch some television, and go to bed. Michael was in his room, as usual. Catherine assumed he was doing homework or sleeping. She did not check on him. She poured wine and sat on the couch, the television providing a soft glow and background noise. She drank slowly, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease slightly with each sip. She thought about her job, about how much she hated dealing with customers, about how she should start looking for a different position, about how she never would because she was tired all the time, and changing jobs would require energy she did not possess. At approximately 11:15 p.m., Michael emerged from his room. Catherine was on her second glass of wine, beginning to drift toward sleep. Michael asked if they could talk. Catherine, surprised by this request, agreed, setting down her wine glass. What Michael wanted to talk about was his suffering. He tried, in the way that a 13-year-old boy who had been isolated and unsupported might try, to communicate that he was not okay, that he needed help, that he was drowning and did not know how to get to the surface. But Michael's communication was clumsy. He could not articulate the depths of his despair in a way that would make Catherine understand the urgency of the situation. He spoke in metaphors and abstractions. He said things like, "I don't think I can keep doing this," and "I don't see the point anymore." Catherine, exhausted and frightened by what she was hearing but not fully comprehending its severity, responded in the way that people often do when confronted with something they cannot fix and do not know how to address. She minimized it. She told Michael that everyone felt that way sometimes, that it would pass, that he needed to stop feeling sorry for himself and focus on things he could control. Michael tried again, more directly this time. He said, "Mom, I think I need to talk to someone, a doctor or something. I think something is wrong with me." Catherine's response was conditioned by her own beliefs about mental illness, beliefs rooted in fear and shame. She told Michael that he did not need a doctor, that doctors could not fix what was actually just a choice, the choice to have a negative attitude. She told him that when she was his age, she had felt depressed too, but she had learned to just push through it. What she meant, in the way she understood it, was comforting. She was trying to tell him that what he felt was temporary, that he would survive it, that everyone did. But what Michael heard was something entirely different. He heard that his suffering was not real, that his mother did not believe him, that he was alone in this, and that there was no one who would help him. The conversation escalated. Catherine, still holding her wine glass, became frustrated with what she perceived as Michael's self-pity and negativity. She raised her voice. She told him that he needed to snap out of it and get his head on straight. She told him that she was making her life harder by being difficult, and that she did not have time for his drama. Michael, pushed beyond the fragile point of his emotional capacity, responded with anger. He said things that he immediately regretted, accusations that his mother did not love him, that she did not care about him, that his life would be better if he was dead. Catherine, struck by these words and frightened by what they suggested, responded in a way that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She stood up, and in her exhaustion and fear and her own deep wounds, she said something that no child should ever hear from their parent. "Fine," she said, her voice cold in a way she did not entirely mean but could not take back once it had been spoken. "If that's really how you feel, then maybe it would be better if you weren't here." The words hung in the air between them. Michael stared at his mother, and she stared back at him, and in that moment, both of them understood that something fundamental had been broken, that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Michael turned and walked back to his room. Catherine, shocked at what she had said, sat back down on the couch. She told herself that she would talk to him tomorrow, that they would have a real conversation, that she would apologize and he would understand that she did not mean it. But she did not go to his room that night. She poured another glass of wine and sat in the darkness, the television playing to an audience that was no longer watching. Michael lay in his bed and did not sleep. He thought about what his mother had said. He thought about how his presence in the world was unwanted, how his existence was a burden, how there was no one who would miss him if he was gone. And in the particular logic of a suicidal adolescent, he constructed a decision. He would not be gone. He would make sure she never had to deal with him again. He would just end it. But as he lay in the darkness, a different thought emerged. A thought born from pain and rage, and a confusion of emotions that his 13-year-old mind could not parse. What if instead of him disappearing, his mother disappeared? What if the problem was not him, but her? What if he simply removed the person who had hurt him, who had rejected him, who had abandoned him to his own darkness? The thought was not a plan, not at first. It was just a thought, a dark fantasy that seemed to offer relief from the crushing weight of despair. But as the hours passed, the thought began to take on a different quality. It began to seem not like fantasy, but like solution. The murder of Catherine Way would have been straightforward, if not for the central complication. The perpetrator was a 13-year-old child. The investigation that followed was not about determining guilt. Michael had confessed immediately, and there was no question about his culpability in the act itself. Rather, the investigation was about understanding why a child would commit such an act, about compiling the psychological and social context that had led to this moment. Detective Maria Santos, who had worked child abuse cases for 15 years, was assigned to lead the investigation. She found a bedroom that told its own story. The computer, where Michael had spent hours absorbing content about death and suffering. The journal, hidden under the mattress, where he had written in detail about his suicidal ideation. The printouts of articles about methods of suicide that he had discovered online. She interviewed Michael's teachers, who described a boy who had become increasingly withdrawn over the past 18 months. A boy who had once been reasonably engaged with schoolwork, but who had deteriorated into someone who seemed barely present in the classroom. She interviewed the school counselor, who revealed that Michael's mother had never brought him in for counseling, despite the school's suggestions that she do so after noting behavioral changes in the 7th grade. She interviewed neighbors who spoke of a quiet house, a boy who was rarely seen outside, a mother who worked long hours and seemed stressed whenever they interacted with her. The picture that emerged was not of a happy household, or even of a typical troubled household. It was of a boy in profound psychological crisis, unsupported, unmonitored, communicating his distress in ways that the adults in his life failed to recognize or address. Michael himself was evaluated by multiple psychologists and psychiatrists. They found a boy who exhibited symptoms of severe depression, who had been actively suicidal, who had experienced the kind of social isolation and psychological rejection that could lead to severe dysregulation. They found no evidence of psychopathy or the kind of inherent evil that might comfort people into believing that this was simply a bad child who had done a bad thing. What they found was a sick child, a child who had been in crisis, a child who should have been receiving mental health treatment and who had instead been left alone to spiral deeper into darkness. Michael Wee arrived at Riverside State Penitentiary on a cold November morning, transported in a vehicle with other prisoners, though he was significantly younger than any of them. He was 13 years old. The average age of other prisoners was 34. He was placed in protective custody, housed in a cell separate from the general population, because there was significant concern that he would be harmed if placed among adult prisoners. A 13-year-old, even one who had committed a terrible crime, was nonetheless a child, and there were instincts among even hardened criminals to protect children, or at minimum, not to harm them gratuitously. But protective custody was its own kind of torture. Michael spent 23 hours a day in a cell, allowed 1 hour in a small exercise yard. He had access to the prison library and to educational programming, but these were cold comforts. He was, in the most literal sense, entombed. The prison administration attempted to process him into the system like any other prisoner, but there was something fundamentally incompatible about a 13-year-old in a maximum security adult penitentiary. His body was still developing, his mind was still forming, and yet he was being held indefinitely in a place designed for the most dangerous people in society. Over the first months, Michael began to understand the finality of his situation. He would not be released when he turned 18. He would not be released when he turned 25. He would not be released, under the terms of his sentence, until he died. The future stretched before him in a line that extended to the horizon and beyond, with nothing to mark the passage of time except the slight changes in his physical body and the accumulated weight of years in confinement. He attempted suicide twice in his first year of incarceration. Both times prison staff intervened and prevented him from succeeding. He was placed on suicide watch and medicated. He was given counseling and support groups. But the fundamental reality of his situation did not change. The appeals and the stagnation. Jennifer Morris filed multiple appeals on Michael's behalf. She argued that sentencing a 13-year-old to life without parole was a violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. She argued that recent Supreme Court decisions had established that adolescent brain development was a critical factor in sentencing considerations, and that a sentencing scheme that did not account for age and potential for rehabilitation was fundamentally unjust. The appeals moved through the system slowly, each one rejected or deferred, each one extending the waiting, each one offering the hope of reversal only to be disappointed. 2 years into his incarceration, one appeal was granted. A higher court ruled that Michael was entitled to a new sentencing hearing, that the original sentencing did not adequately account for his age and psychological condition. Michael was transported back to the courthouse where his original trial had occurred, and a new judge was assigned to determine an appropriate sentence. The new judge, a woman named Patricia Hammond, listened to updated psychiatric testimony about Michael's condition, his mental state, his prognosis. The expert witnesses testified that Michael, now 15 years old, had made some progress in his psychological recovery, that he had responded positively to mental health treatment, that he demonstrated genuine remorse for his actions. But Judge Hammond ultimately decided to uphold the original sentence. She found that while Michael's youth and mental illness were important factors, they did not justify releasing someone who had brutally murdered another human being back into society. She imposed life without parole again, and the appeals process continued its slow grinding. Michael accepted his fate with a kind of resignation. He participated in education programs, earning his GED and later taking college courses available through a prison program. He became known among other prisoners as the young kid who stayed out of trouble, who read constantly, who had a kind of distant melancholy about him. By the time Michael was 21 years old, he had spent 7 years in prison. He would spend many more. The exact number was unknowable, whether 50, 60, or 70 more years, but the direction was certain. He was going to die in prison. The aftermath. The case of Michael Wee received national attention, not immediately after the crime, but years later, when the question of whether it is just to sentence children to life without parole became a matter of serious public debate. Activists and organizations focused on juvenile justice began to point to Michael's case as an example of the problems with the system. They argued that no 13-year-old, regardless of what they had done, should be sentenced to die in prison, that a lifetime of incarceration precluded the possibility of redemption, that a system that treated children as adults for purposes of punishment but did not treat them as adults for any other purpose was fundamentally hypocritical. But others argued that the severity of the crime justified the severity of the sentence, that some acts were simply unforgivable, that Michael's psychological illness did not erase his responsibility for choosing to murder his mother. Catherine Wee's extended family, interviewed years after the crime, expressed conflicting feelings. They spoke about their loss, about the person Catherine had been, about the lives that had been disrupted by her death. But some of them also spoke about Michael, about the boy he had been before the darkness consumed him, about whether a system that incarcerated a child for eternity was actually justice, or merely revenge wearing the mask of law. Michael himself, when interviewed by a journalist years into his sentence, spoke about his crime with a clarity and a remorse that seemed genuine. He said, "I was a sick kid. I was in crisis. My mother was in crisis. Neither of us knew how to help the other person, and the system that was supposed to help us both failed us completely." He paused, looking at his hands. He continued, "I killed my mother. That's real. That's something I have to live with forever. And I think that's appropriate, that I have to live with it forever. But I'm not sure that living with it forever in a prison cell is the same thing as justice. I think justice might have been my mother and me both getting help before we got to that point. Justice might have been me getting treatment instead of being told to snap out of it." He looked directly at the camera. "But we don't live in that world. We live in this one." Michael Way is now 31 years old.
He has spent 18 years in prison. If he lives to be 75, he will spend another 44 years there. His life is one of routine, work assignments that pay 50 cents a day, education programs that provide some intellectual stimulation, therapy sessions that address the psychological trauma of his actions and his incarceration, and long hours alone in his cell. He has published essays about his experience in literary journals. He has become a pen pal to other incarcerated young people, offering advice and perspective on how to survive years of confinement. He has, in the limited ways available to him, attempted to transform his existence into something meaningful. The law has changed somewhat since his sentencing. The Supreme Court has ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for children are unconstitutional, that children must be given the opportunity to be considered for parole, that age and potential for rehabilitation must be weighed against the severity of the crime. But these changes do not retroactively apply to Michael Way. His sentence stands. His case is not reviewed under the new standards. He remains trapped in the consequences of both his crime and the legal system's response to it. Catherine Way's death remains a tragedy. She was a woman who loved her son, who was doing the best she could with limited resources and limited understanding, and who was brutally murdered by that son in a moment of crisis that neither of them saw coming. Michael Way's incarceration remains a tragedy as well, though of a different kind. He is a man who committed a terrible crime when he was a child, when his brain was not fully developed, when he was in the grip of an untreated mental illness, and who has been punished with a sentence that is extraordinary in its permanence. Both tragedies stem from the same root, a society that did not provide adequate mental health services to a struggling adolescent and his struggling mother, that allowed a child to deteriorate into a suicidal state without intervention, that ultimately responded to catastrophe with a legal mechanism that was designed for retribution rather than for reformation. Michael Way will likely die in prison. Whether that represents justice or injustice, whether his suffering and his mother's death constitute a necessary consequence of his choice or a failure of multiple systems that had opportunities to prevent the tragedy, these are questions that have no easy answers. What is certain is that 2 lives have been destroyed, that a town learned that safety is an illusion, and that a boy who was 13 years old when he committed his crime will spend his entire adult life in confinement, a prisoner to both the consequences of his actions and the limitations of a system designed to punish rather than to heal.